Okay, so you've given us a ton of material on legalism in ancient China.
Yeah, a lot to dig through.
Articles, research notes, it's quite a bit.
Definitely a deep dive.
And that's exactly what we are going to do today.
Sounds good.
Our mission is to sort of cut through all of it and get to like the really core insights. What was legalism really all about?
Yeah.
What kind of impact did it have?
Right, yeah.
And why does it even matter today?
Big questions.
Huge.
Yeah.
So think of this like your cheat sheet to understanding a really important movement.
A shortcut.
Yeah,
A historical and philosophical shortcut
I like it.
to legalism.
To legalism in ancient China.
Exactly.
So just to give you a little taste of where we are going today, we're going to look at how different legalism was from something like Confucianism.
Right. Huge difference.
We'll see how legalism, came to be with the Qin Dynasty and then kind of disappeared quickly.
Yeah, very dramatic.
And then the most interesting thing, I think, is how some of its core ideas are still around today.
Yeah, it's surprising how relevant it still is.
Totally. Okay, so first things first, what is legalism?
So legalism, it's a philosophical and political doctrine.
Okay.
That's all about strict laws, lots of control, and this idea that humans are basically selfish.
So not exactly a warm and fuzzy view of humanity.
Not really.
Yeah.
No. They believe that people only behave if there are strict rules and punishments.
Interesting. So that's pretty different from Confucianism, right?
Oh, yeah. Completely different.
Which is more about like cultivating virtue and relationships.
Exactly. Confucianism is all about ethical behavior, ritual harmony.
Yeah.
Really different visions of society.
Makes sense. Okay, so when did legalism actually pop up on this scene?
So it emerged during a pretty chaotic time in Chinese history.
Okay.
The Warring States period, from 475 to 221 BCE.
Got it. So lots of conflict.
Constant warfare between all these different states.
Yikes. So legalism was kind of a response to that.
Yeah, rulers were desperate for something to bring order to stabilize their states.
To survive, basically.
Exactly, and legalism seemed like a practical solution.
I see. So it's like, forget about individual morality. Just focus on laws and enforcement.
Precisely.
Okay, well, that makes sense in that context.
Yeah, it's all about control.
So who are the big brains behind this whole legalist thing?
So we got to talk about three key figures. First up, Sheng Yang.
Okay.
He lived from 390 to 338 BCE.
Got it.
He was like a super influential statesman in the Qin state. And he's the one who put a lot of legalist ideas into actual practice.
So he wasn't just a theorist. He was like a doer.
Exactly. He made it happen.
So what kind of things did he actually do?
Well, he changed a lot of things.
Yeah.
For example, he made it so land could be bought and sold.
Wow. So like private property.
Exactly. Which was a huge shift from the old feudal system.
Yeah, that's a big deal.
He also reformed the military.
Okay. How so?
He created a system where your rank was based on what you did on the battlefield.
So no more just inheriting your position?
Nope, it was all about merit. And he also established a unified legal code for everyone with clear punishments.
So he was all about making things clear and consistent.
Yeah, very systematic.
It sounds pretty efficient, even if it was maybe a little harsh.
Yeah, efficient and effective. That was the legalist way.
Okay, so Sheng Yang was the guy who put it into action.
Right, but then we have Han Feisi.
Okay, another important figure.
Huge. He lived around 280 to 233 BCE.
Got it.
And he basically took Sheng Yang's ideas and made them into like a whole philosophical system.
So he was the thinker.
Yeah, the big picture guy.
What did he believe?
Well, he was all about the ruler having absolute power.
Okay.
And he believed that laws were the only way to control everyone, even ministers.
So not even the top guys were above the law?
In theory, no. But of course, the ruler was the one who made the laws.
Right, so kind of loophole there.
Yeah, but the idea was that everyone was subject to the legal system.
Interesting. So Han Feisi provided like the intellectual framework for legalism.
Absolutely. He laid out the reasoning behind it all.
Okay, and who's our third legalist superstar?
That would be Li Si.
Li Si.
He lived from 280 to 208 BCE.
Got it.
He was actually a student of Han Feisi.
Okay, so he was carrying the torch.
Yeah, and he became the prime minister of Qin Shi Huang.
That's the first emperor of a unified China, right?
Exactly. And Li Si was crucial in making legalism the official way of running the empire.
So he was like the implementer.
Right. He took it to the national level.
Okay, so we have the practitioner, the theorist, and the guy who scaled it up.
Perfect summary.
That's a great way to understand those three figures.
Yeah, they were all essential.
So let's dig into these core principles of legalism you mentioned.
Okay, sounds good.
First up, the rule of law. What did that mean to the legalists?
So this is where it gets a little different from how we think about the rule of law today.
How so?
For the legalists, it wasn't about like individual rights or abstract justice.
Okay.
It was all about keeping order in the state.
Got it.
So when they said laws should be clear and public,
Yep.
it was so that everyone do what they could and couldn't do.
And what would happen if they stepped out of line?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the laws had to apply to everyone equally, no exceptions.
No special treatment for the rich and powerful.
Nope. Same rules for everyone.
So it was less about fairness and more about predictability and control.
Exactly. It was a tool for governing.
Okay. That's a really important distinction to keep in mind.
Definitely, it helps us understand their mindset.
Right, next up is strict punishments and rewards. That sounds pretty straightforward.
It does, but the emphasis was really on the punishments.
So we're talking serious consequences.
Oh, yeah. They believed in harsh punishments to stop people from breaking the law.
Like what kind of punishments?
Well, we're talking executions, mutilations, forced labor.
Wow, for any offense.
Sometimes even for minor things.
That seems a bit extreme.
The idea was that if the punishment was scary enough, people wouldn't even think about breaking the law.
So basically, rule by fear.
Pretty much.
Okay, but what about the rewards? You said punishments and rewards.
All right, so there were rewards too, but mainly for people who follow the rules perfectly.
And for those who did things that helped the state.
Exactly like serving in the military or contributing to the economy.
So the carrot and the stick approach.
Yeah, although the stick was definitely bigger.
Makes sense. Okay, so that leads us to the next principle, centralized authority and absolute rule.
Right. And this follows logically from everything we've talked about.
Yeah, it's all about control.
Exactly. The legalists believed that a single all-powerful ruler was essential for order.
So a king or emperor with total authority.
Exactly. And they thought that power had to be maintained through surveillance.
Okay, like keeping an eye on everyone.
Yeah, especially officials.
Making sure they were loyal.
Right. And they also believed in a really efficient bureaucracy that answered directly to the ruler.
So a very top-down system.
Absolutely no room for individual initiative or dissent.
Okay, that makes sense given their view of human nature.
Right. Which brings us to the next principle.
Which is that human nature is inherently selfish.
Exactly. This was a fundamental belief for them.
And it's the opposite of what Confucians believed, right?
Oh, yeah, completely. Confucians thought people could be good.
And that education could make them better.
Right. But legalists were much more pessimistic.
They thought people were only out for themselves.
Yeah, they thought people were driven by greed and fear.
So trying to appeal to their better nature was pointless.
Basically, they thought the only way to control people was through strict laws and punishments.
So a pretty cynical view of humanity.
Yeah, but it shaped their whole philosophy.
Makes sense. And finally, we have the principle of suppression of dissent.
Right, and this is probably the most controversial aspect of legalism.
Yeah, this is where we get to the whole burning books and burying scholars thing.
Exactly, that's the most extreme example.
Not exactly known for their tolerance of different viewpoints.
Not at all. They saw any kind of debate or criticism as a threat to the state.
So they shut it all down.
They did. They got rid of any books that didn't agree with them.
And they punished anyone who spoke out against them.
Yeah, it was a very strict system.
Okay, so we've covered the core principles. Now let's talk about the impact of legalism.
All right, let's do it.
And obviously the biggest thing is the Qin Dynasty.
Yeah, that's the most significant example.
So how did legalism help create this unified China?
Well, remember, the warring states, period.
Right, all that chaos.
Exactly. Legalism gave the Qin state an advantage.
Okay.
Because they were so focused on a strong central government, strict laws.
And a powerful military.
Right, they were like a well-oiled machine.
And all thanks to Sheng Yang's reforms.
Exactly. He set the stage.
Then Qin Shi Huang came along.
Right.
With Li Si as his right-hand man.
Yep, and they used legalism to conquer all of China.
So it was the key to their success.
Actually.
And then they used it to run the entire empire.
It was the blueprint for their government.
So it wasn't just theory. It was put into practice on a massive scale.
Yeah, and they did some pretty drastic things.
Like what?
Well, they standardized everything. Weights, measures, currency, even writing.
Wow, so everyone was on the same page, literally.
Yeah, it made things much easier to control.
Makes sense.
They also built tons of roads.
For trade and moving troops?
Exactly, and they started building the Great Wall.
Oh, yeah, that was a massive project.
A symbol of their power.
And their control.
Right. And of course, the whole government was based on legalist principles.
Officials were appointed based on merit.
And loyalty.
And they were held accountable by those strict laws.
Exactly.
So basically a complete transformation of China.
Yeah, a total overhaul.
But as we know, the Qin Dynasty didn't last very long.
Not at all.
Why was that? Was it because of legalism?
Well, legalism had its downsides.
Okay. Like what?
It was just too harsh and inflexible.
People got tired of it.
They did. The punishments were brutal. The taxes were high.
And there was all that forced labor.
Yeah, building the Great Wall and the Emperor's Tomb.
So it was a recipe for resentment.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the legalist system didn't allow for any leniency or compromise.
So there was no room for error?
No. And it led to rebellions.
And ultimately, the collapse of the dynasty.
Yeah, it just wasn't sustainable in the long run.
So legalism helped create the empire, but it also destroyed it.
That's a good way to put it.
So what happened to legalism after that?
Did it just disappear?
Right.
No, not completely.
Okay.
Later dynasties learned from the Qin's mistakes.
They realized they couldn't be so extreme.
Right, so they took a more balanced approach.
Like the Han Dynasty.
Yeah, they adopted Confucianism,
Okay.
which emphasized morality and social harmony.
So a softer touch.
Yeah, but they still kept some of the practical things from legalism,
Like what?
like the centralized government and the efficient bureaucracy.
So it was like legalism light.
Yeah, they took the good parts and left the bad parts.
Smart.
Yeah, they adapted it to their needs.
Okay, so legalism didn't completely die out.
No, it evolved.
And you said it's even relevant today.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing, actually.
Where do we see its influence?
Well, if you look at some modern authoritarian governments,
Okay.
you can see some similarities with legalist ideas,
Like what?
like the focus on strict laws and strong enforcement,
Uh-huh.
and the concentration of power in the hands of a few.
And the use of surveillance to keep people in line?
Exactly. It's all about control and order.
So legalism never really went away.
It's still around in different forms.
Wow, that's pretty scary.
Yeah, it is something to think about.
But you said it's not just authoritarian regimes.
Right, there are echoes of legalism in democratic systems, too.
Really? How so?
Well, think about it. We still have laws that apply to everyone.
True.
And we expect those laws to be clear and public.
Yeah.
And we have a legal system that's supposed to deter crime.
So those are all legalist ideas.
They are.
Yeah.
And even though our systems are based on different values,
Like fairness and individual rights.
right, the mechanics of law enforcement still have that legalist flavor.
So legalism is like this underlying current in how we think about law and order.
Exactly. It's part of our heritage.
Okay, so let's talk about the downsides of legalism.
Right, because there were definitely some big ones.
Yeah. It wasn't exactly a perfect system.
Not at all.
Yeah.
The main criticism is that it was just too brutal.
The punishments were way too harsh.
Yeah, and it led to a lot of suffering.
And the strict control over everything made people miserable.
It was oppressive and stifling.
And there was no room for individual circumstances?
No, everyone was treated the same, regardless of the situation.
It was inflexible and unfair.
Exactly, and the suppression of dissent had long-term consequences, too.
It stifled creativity and innovation.
Right, because people were afraid to think differently.
And they were afraid to speak out.
Yeah, it created a culture of fear.
So legalism was effective in the short term.
But it caused a lot of harm in the long term.
It's a cautionary tale.
Definitely.
Okay, so to wrap up,
Yeah.
for our listeners, we've explored the key principles of legalism.
Right.
Strict laws, harsh punishments, centralized power, the belief that people are selfish, and the need to silence dissent.
It's a pretty intense philosophy.
It is. We've seen how it helped unify China, but also how it led to the Qin Dynasty's downfall.
Yeah, it's a fascinating case study.
And we've talked about its surprising relevance even today.
It's more influential than we might think.
Definitely. So here's something for everyone to ponder.
Okay.
Given everything we've learned about legalism, its focus on control, its successes, and its failures,
Yeah.
what do you think about the balance between order and freedom?
That's a big question.
It is.
Yeah.
How much control is too much?
Right.
How do we create a society that's safe and stable without sacrificing individual liberty?
It's a challenge that we still face today.
Exactly. And legalism gives us a lot to think about.
A lot to consider.
Yeah. So there you have it. That's legalism in a nutshell.
Or a deep dive.
A deep dive. Exactly.
Thanks for listening.
Thanks for joining us.